Okay, hello everybody. I think we are going to start. I'm quite excited because this is the first in-person lecture I have had to introduce since becoming the ICS director last October. We had one party in February in real life, and we've had some online lectures, but this is the first in-person lecture, so thank you for coming. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Marion Meyer, who is here as our AD Trendall Fellow this term. A trip that was put off for 1 year. Just 1 year because of COVID, but we're really glad that you're here, and actually you can be with us for quite a long period as well, from April to June. Professor Meyer, Marion is a classical archaeologist and an ancient historian. She has spent quite a bit of her working career in Vienna, but she's German, and she trained in Bonn and Munich. She got her PhD from Bonn in 1984, and you habilitated yourself, if I can put it that way, something that doesn't exist here, in Hamburg in 1997. With a thesis on these Hellenistic figures with tower crowns, mural crowns. And after teaching in Munich and Hamburg and in Florida, Marion was Professor of Classical Archaeology first at Bonn and then from 2003 to 2020 at Vienna. And she still lives in Vienna, yes. As many of you already know, Marion has broad research interest in ancient Greek culture with a particular focus on the relationship of images, political discourse, cultural history, visual communication, and images and narrative. She's published on visual culture in the Eastern Mediterranean, its role in acculturation, and one of her current research projects is around representations of Arsinoe II and Ptolemy II Philadelphus. But she also has a very, very strong and lasting interest in the culture of classical Athens and has published a lot in that area. Her most recent research monograph on Athena, goddess of Athens, cult and myth on the Acropolis until classical times was published in 2017. And it's the classical Athenian side of your interest that you're working on at the ICS with a project about commemoration of the dead, both publicly and privately in the 5th century. So that will also be the topic of Professor Meyer's lecture. And I hand over to you now for your Trendall lecture, Death in the City, Commemoration of the Dead in Athens in the 5th century BCE. Thank you very much.
Good evening. First of all, I want to express my warmest thanks to you, Catherine, and to the Institute for awarding me this Trendall Fellowship. It gives me the opportunity to pursue a study that I've begun quite some time ago, but which has not proceeded the way I wanted it due to various obligations. And when I took long Easter walks in London, I realized what a perfect place London is for any study on commemoration. So I'm very grateful and very happy to be here. Monuments for the dead are indicative for anthropology, sociology, and history, and as archaeologists, of course, we are historians. The vast majority of them were and are produced on private initiative upon the death of a member of a family or the community. They commemorate ephemeral lives and, pretending to last forever, defy the momentariness of human life. As an archaeologist, I focus on the material evidence, on the monuments erected at the tombs and on the images to be seen there. Since ancient Athens provides ample evidence in addition to archaeological sources, there's a chance to get more specific insights into the intentions and receptions of such memorials than the archaeological record as such would allow. In Athens, within the time span of only 3 generations from the reform of Cleisthenes in 5087 to the first decade of the Peloponnesian War, there were drastic changes in the organization of burials and commemoration, and there is evidence for private and public agency and intentions. I think that the most promising approach for analyzing the interests and the logic that materialize in monuments of commemoration is a diachronic perspective. It is my goal to explore the interplay of traditions and innovations and the dynamics of decisions and reactions. Owing to the preliminary state of my project, you will be hearing more about the early 5th century than the later one. The German word for cemetery, Friedhof, conveys a place where you rest in peace, Friede, a quiet, secluded place. The Athenians, like their fellow Greeks, did not bury their dead in such places, but along busy roads that led out of the city. As it was customary elsewhere in ancient Greece since the beginning of the Iron Age, a dead person normally received an individual grave. Even if a pre-existing burial ground was used, a new grave was dug for fresh burial. Grave monuments were erected and displayed where they were to be seen, and the rites at the tomb were performed in public sight. A private affair, the death of a family member, claimed public space in the topographical and the social meaning of the word. When in the second half of the 7th century, the first life-size and over-life-size stone sculptures were made, this new medium began to be used for tomb monuments of elite families. The Athenians adopted it in the early 6th century and replaced the traditional grave markers, clay vases, by marble statues and reliefs. Both media, the pottery and the sculptures, conveyed the deceased's gender and his or her social role in society. The greater, for male burials, had marked the male person as a participant in banquets. This type of amphora, the one to the right here, alluded to the female task of fetching water and using it for washing and purification. And I see a realization, thank you, right now, thank you, Valerie. The images had shown the community performing the proper rites, the progesis and the ekphora, with many women wailing. With a new medium, the focus shifted to the deceased person who was the subject of both statues and reliefs and whose name was added in the inscription. About 30 kuroi, 5 kurai, and 42 reliefs survive, and with fragments of bases and crowning sphinxes, there will be a total of about 120 to 180 attested monuments in Attica, produced in the course of 3 or 4 generations. These numbers, although much higher than in any other Greek polis, reveal that modern memorials were exceptions and a privilege of the elite. The statue type of the kouros focuses on the attractive, trained body of the deceased, a body fit for performances in various contests. The female counterpart, much rarer, adds lavish garments and jewelry to natural beauty and conveys youth by fruit, flowers, wreath, or a dove. The statues do not give information about the deceased's biography, but their inscriptions might. Chrysos died fighting, and Prasyclea died before she got married. And the epigrams might enhance the mimetic character of the statues by addressing the passerby, as in the case of Chrysos, or by making the statues speak for themselves, as is the case with Prasyclea. The statues thus present the deceased persons, whereas the reliefs remind of them. And they do so by representing them in a particular role, preferably that of an athlete, whereas warriors do not appear until about 530. Grave statues and reliefs have common goals of commemoration. The monument as such, and as an image, was to convey and perpetuate time, honor, and kleos, glory. The monument by ostentatious display, precious marble, impressive dimensions, quality of execution, and the image by constructing a social persona of the deceased. Since this distinction was the concern of man, monuments were predominantly made for male persons. Epigrams and iconography suggest that most of these monuments were erected for persons who had died young. They were to preserve the memory of those who had been struck by an untimely death. Which memory was to be preserved depended on the social role of the deceased persons, but also on the preferences and decisions of the family. Did Thrasicleia really die shortly before she was married, as the epigram seems to suggest, or did she actually die quite younger and her parents wanted her to be remembered as a bride, because after all, what else might a daughter be? These types of monuments ended more or less with the archaic period. The stylistically most progressive grave statues and reliefs are dated around 500 BCE. There are, however, clues for a continuation of grave monuments into the early 5th century. Several statue bases preserved without their sculptures are dated by epigraphists to the 1st or even the 2nd quarter of the 5th century. And the stylistically most advanced terracotta plaques, which adorned box-shaped grave monuments, seem to be later than the 6th century. The end of private grave monuments might be due to a sumptuary law reported by Cicero. The authenticity and relevance of the sumptuary law have been contested, but since a law just attests to a decision without explaining it, we have to look elsewhere for reasons for the discontinuation of the custom to erect private memorials for the dead. The initiation of a new custom, the state burial for the war dead, provides a context because it shifted the authority for decisions about distinction and commemoration from private persons to the demos. This apparently had an impact on other burials as well. The date of the introduction of the state burial is debated, but this would be the wrong question to start with. We have to ask, how do we define state burial? And there is more than one plausible answer. And what were its essential innovations? The locus classicus is Thucydides in the passage that precedes Pericles' famous funeral speech. In the same winter, following the Patrios Nomos, the Athenians held a state funeral for those who had been the first to die in this war. He then describes the ceremony of this first year of the Peloponnesian War, a processus of 2 days to which the family could bring any offerings, an ekphora with 10 wooden coffins for the 10 phylae, plus an empty cleaner for those who could not be recovered. Anyone, Athenian or foreigner, could participate in the procession, and the female relatives were to wail at the taphos. Then the fallen were buried in the Demosion Sima, which is situated in the most beautiful suburb. Thucydides then turns from the report of this one event to the ritual as such. There they always bury those fallen in war. And en auto refers to the proasteion, to the suburb. The burial of the Marathonomachoi in Marathon is said to be an exception, a passage to which we will return. An epitaphios logos is held, and then the people depart. Thucydides finishes this report by saying that throughout the year, whenever occasion arose, they practiced this nomos. He then turns from the custom to the specific event. In this winter, Pericles was elected as a speaker, and he proceeds from the Sema to the Bema. In the later 5th century, we learn, the state burial consisted of a ceremony for all the war dead of 1 year of campaign, celebrated in winter, with the usual rites performed in a fixed location, followed by a collective burial in the Demosion Sema and an Epitaphios Logos. Demosion Sema is a term that only appears here, hapax. It must refer to the tomb of this one occasion when the speaker goes from the Sema to the Bema. It has been falsely taken as a terminus technicus for an area reserved for state burials as a kind of national cemetery. However, there was no such a reserved area. According to further literary and epigraphic evidence, the state burials were situated in the Keramaikos, along the excessively broad road that led from the Dipylon to the Academy. But, as the analysis of the archaeological evidence shows, there were also private graves and workshops along this road. The state burials clustered in front of the Dipylon and near the entrance to the Academy, and extended to the road to the east next to it, as Nathan Arrington has demonstrated. Demosthenes and other authors refer to the monuments of the state burial as demosia nemata or demosioi taphoi, and these are the terms that I will use. Finds made in that area can give us an idea what these nemata looked like. They consisted of one stele or several stelae that recorded the names of those who had died. The inscriptions were topped by the locations of the various battles and listed the fallen men in columns arranged according to their phylae. The first such monument preserved was erected in 464 after a campaign in the northern Aegean. Based on that inscription and a remark by Pausanias, the introduction of the state burial has been dated to the mid-460s, and the term state burial has been reserved for a ceremony that contains all the characteristics reported by Thucydides, namely the collective burial of all the war dead of a year of campaign, and this is a legitimate decision. I wonder, though, whether this definition captures the actual innovation of burial and commemoration practice. Burial and commemoration were the traditional duties of one's kin. There were exceptional cases in which this service could not be given. If one died as a captive or as a victim of the plague, one would end up in a mass grave. It is an open question whether in the archaic period mass burials were the norm for those who fell in battle, or whether repatriation was practiced at least for those whose families could somehow arrange it. The evidence seems inconclusive. The actual practice will have depended on the distance of the battlefield and the means of the respective families. The horror vision that troubled the heroes in Homer's poems, being left unattended and exposed to mutilation by animals, points to a fate that might not have been uncommon. The recovery of a fallen man with or without armor was a recurrent theme of visual media since the early 7th century. You see two examples here. I argued elsewhere, following Luca Giuliani, that this composition was created and used for anonymous persons, and then, since the early 6th century, exemplified by epic heroes. Ajax carrying dead Achilles. The images attest to a common concern and a shared ideal. They were a moral appeal and the expression of hope to receive at least the corpse of the fallen family member. How often surviving comrades and family members might have succeeded in retrieving bodies is of course unknown. There is evidence for mass burials of Athenian war dead organized by the state since the time the demos appears as a decision-making body, that is, after the Cleisthenic reforms. An epigram mentions a Sema erected in Euboea by the demos, and this is probably the tomb of the Athenians who fell in 506 fighting the Chalcidians, so Demosea and Sena. The demos assumed responsibility for those who fell for the community, and this responsibility materialized in a collective burial near the site of the battle. The polis demonstrated that it did not leave anybody unattended. The war dead were not split up into those who were taken home and commemorated individually and those who received a mass burial at best. After the Battle of Marathon in 490, a huge tumulus was erected on the battlefield for the 192 Athenian citizens who had fallen. Subsequently, the demos set up 10 stelae, one for each phyle. The one for the phyle Erechtheis was found in the villa of Herodes Atticus in the Peloponnese just a few years ago. It lists the names of 22 fallen men and adds an epigram praising them for their virtues and for having brought glory to Athens. Thucydides claims that the burial of the Marathonomachoi on the site was a special honor, an exception of the Patrios Nomos, but it was not. In 479, the Athenians fallen in the Battle of Plataea also received a tumulus on site, as did their combatants. And it is hard to accept burial near the battlefield as a special honor, given the common idea of recovery. The persistence of this idea of recovery is proven by the subsequent progress of state involvement. Pausanias mentions a public tomb for the Athenians who fell in the battle at the Eurymedon, the last one against the Persians, in the early 460s. So this was a case of repatriation before the joint burial of all the war dead of 1 year's campaign became the rule a few years later. And there is a prominent case of repatriation which contributed to setting the standard. Cimon, the leading politicians of the 470s and 460s, is credited with having brought back the bones of Theseus from the distant island of Skyros. Thus, within the first decade after the end of the Persian Wars, the Athenian decided to make the dream come true and take all the fallen men back home as a standard practice, and to bury and honor them all near the Dipylon Gate. Whatever the practice in archaic Athens had been, mass burials on the burial site or individual recovery, the promise of common repatriation of the war dead is, I think, the crucial innovation and a conceptual turning point in handling burial and commemoration of the war dead. Not only the fallen men should return home and be buried with a proper ceremony, their commemoration should not be left to the places where they had happened to die either. It should be linked to the city for which they had died. This is the very core of the state burial as an institution. A place next to the city gates and along a busy road did not only give the fallen a topographical space, but also a social space where they were commemorated by those for whom they had lost their lives. The war dead were credited with significance, remembrance, and honor. The decisive motivation for repatriation was the appreciation of service for the polis, which was communicated to any passer-by. I will argue that this memorial for the fighters of the Persian Wars is a key monument for the process toward the institution of the state burial as such. It stood at the Academy Road and consisted of a base at least 5 meters long, which supported at least 3 stelae according to the persuasive reconstruction by Manolis Kores. In the space, 2 epigrams were inscribed by 2 different hands, and the definite article used in both epigrams with regard to men praised for their performance in war points to those whose names were written on the stele above the base. Whereas most scholars agree that the epigrams in the lower zones, that is A2 and on the third block C, that these epigrams refer to the Battle of Marathon, fought before the Hyle, before the gates of the city. The reading and interpretation of the epigram above, A1, is controversial, and the passage that mentions ships is restored. Some think that it also praises the Marathonomachoi and that the entire monument was a cenotaph for them. I join those who argue that the claim to have saved all Hellas from slavery refers to the campaign of 480 and namely to the Battle of Salamis. What is important for my argument here is just the fact that in addition to the monument in Marathon, this was one for the Marathonomachoi as well. By celebrating the fighters of Marathon, it brought them back to the city, so to speak, although they were buried in northern Attica. It thus demonstrates the Athenians' interest in commemorating their war dead within sight, near the city. And they commemorated the fighters by praising them for their service to the community. Elena Valtakaridi and Cesare Kusevich have emphasized that Athenian grave epigrams of the archaic period focused on praising the dead individual. The polis, the community, is never mentioned, unlike in epigrams of war dead in other parts of Greece. In archaic times, the Athenians died for their own glory. This monument and the stele for the Phyle Erechtheis that stood at the tumulus in Marathon are the first Athenian inscriptions which attest appreciation of the war dead for their service to the community. The monument at the Academy Road that honors men who were buried elsewhere thus marks a decisive step towards the introduction of the state burial. We have to keep in mind what a radical step that was. Whatever the fate of the war dead in archaic times had been, the king's responsibility for burial and commemoration had not been questioned. With the state burial, however, the demos appropriated the authority over the war dead, regularly and permanently, in case of victory or defeat, and the demos decided about their bodies and about their persona to be remembered. The erection and the design of a grave monument was no longer a private decision taken when necessary, but a planned and established procedure for all of the fallen without distinction and without consideration of personal merit. To have given one's life for the polis was the only qualification for inclusion. The dead individual was listed and commemorated as a member of his phyle, as a member of the polis, a community with a common cause. Thereby, his death was charged with a meaning and an importance. The state burial deprived the families of one of their fundamental duties. As Thucydides says, they were to participate in the ceremony and practice the traditional rites. They brought offerings, took part in the processions, and the female relatives waited at the tomb. The families had, however, no authority over their dead relatives anymore. They could no longer decide how to commemorate him. Those who had been the protagonists in the ritual of burial and commemoration of the tomb, the female relatives, were, just like the male ones, reduced to the status of visitors. Unlike the male family members, however, they had no voice in the assembly where the man had decided about the state burial and where they were able to modify or abolish it if they wished. I do not mean to say that female Athenians, or male ones for that matter, would have felt overpowered or ignored or neglected. The solemn atmosphere of the ceremony, the honors awarded to the dead by the polis, the praises in the epitaphos logos, all that surely caused pride, and the experience of sharing grief and feeling of loss with so many other families will have been a source of comfort. The fact remains that the families had lost their agency in dealing with the modes of commemoration. Would every mother and every father have wished their son to be remembered as a war dead? We have some evidence for private choices of rituals and images that I would see as reactions to the state's claim of authority over matter of burial and commemoration. From circa 470 to the end of the 5th century, lekythoi, traditional containers of perfumed oil, were decorated in the white ground technique to serve the pulchral functions. They were given as grave goods or deposited next to the tombs after the oil had been used for ointment. Their images provide a unique insight into the concerns of the Athenians in these decades. The most frequent subjects are preparations for a visit to the tomb, the rites performed at the tomb, and after the middle of the 5th century, imaginary encounters with the dead family member at the site of the tomb. The vast majority of the figures involved are female. The preparations are exclusively made by women, and those who visit the grave and perform rites are predominantly female. In scenes of imaginary encounters, both the visitor and the dead person may be male or female. Scenes that show the deceased person standing next to the tombstone are touching as they visualize the experience of separation, the wish to overcome it, and the sadness about the impossibility to get in touch with the beloved person. On the Berlin lekythos, you see a grieving father standing next to a tombstone where his son is depicted as a hoplite. And on the Munich lekythos, a woman reaches out for an effigy. The images on the lekythoi highlight activities that had been an established custom for a long time, but never been shown in images. Only prosthesis scenes had a tradition back to late geometric times, but in that period, the display of an opulent ceremony with a lot of wailing women had been the focus of the representation, whereas the comparatively few lekythoi with such a scene concentrate on few wailing family members. The main theme of the lekythoi is the performance of commemoration rites, binding ribbons around the stele, pouring libations, and leaving lekythoi and wreaths at the grave. Tangible demonstration of the respect paid to the dead. These were the duties of the female members of the family, and unlike most of their tasks which were taken for granted, they now became the subject of images displayed at the tombs for public view. This is compelling evidence for the vastly shared wish to assure the continuity of private practices, to affirm the custom that had seemed as a matter of course, and to demonstrate this continuity in public. I see the emergence of the white lekythoi with the touching images as a private reaction to the introduction of the state burial with its claim of authority over the dead. A reaction not in the sense of an opposition or compensation, but as a sign of awareness of a responsibility and a traditional right that had to be maintained. These vessels and their images at the grave loudly reminded of the fact that the state burial was, after all, an exception, and the commemoration of the dead remained a private affair. It is striking how the main scenes of the lekythoi focus on the grave and on the grave marker. The lekythoi, poured in the basket, will be deposited there. The ribbons will decorate the stele. The monument can be the focus of attention or the site of the encounter with a dead person. The insistent on the grave monument attests to the wish of having a specific space for commemoration. At the time when these vases were made, there is hardly any evidence for private grave monuments. The grave stele and the egg-shaped tumuli we see on the white lekythoi are not attested archaeologically, though they either did not exist or they consisted of material that did not survive. Judy Berenger most recently elaborated on a suggestion made by several scholars and argued that stelae did persist, but they were made of wood and painted. The images of the lekythoi, with their insistence on the attention given to the practice of rites and the imagined encounter with a dead family member, were no silent protest against the ban of private monuments or the state monuments for the war dead. There were no restrictions of performing the customary rites at the family tombs or at the Demosia Mimata. It is therefore very telling that the lekythoi, with their insistence on the grave stele as a space for commemoration, emerged just at the time when the family's responsibility for burial and commemoration, previously never questioned or infringed, was claimed by the polis, and that at the end of the 5th century, they gave way to marble lekythoi after marble grave monuments had become customary. The lekythoi attest to the desire to commemorate a dead family member with and at a personal grave monument. From around 430 to around 310 BCE, the Athenians set up marble grave reliefs in family precincts, lined up on top of the facade along the road to be viewed by passers-by. This is not a resumption of an older custom of setting up marble monuments after a rigid period of radical democratic equality. It was a genuine innovation for the following reasons. First, these reliefs are a mass phenomenon. There are about 2,700 preserved pieces made in the course of just 4 generations. Second, there is a wide range of types of monuments of various dimensions and quality, and this points to a wide range of purchasers. These were monuments not just for elite families. Third, most images do not show the single person of the deceased, the single figure of the deceased person, but 2 or more figures. And fourth, in the reliefs, we see male and female persons of all age groups, and a relief might be erected for any person, male or female, young or old. There were preferences, as you will see, but principally nobody was excluded. Why marble grave reliefs began to be erected around 430 BCE has not yet been convincingly answered. Private initiative apparently took the lead, with reliefs for state monuments setting in some years later. Those who see the devastating plague of the early 420s as a reason for disregarding the sumptuary law or simply for coping with the tragic loss of a family member, or an explanation for the fact that the mass production of votive reliefs and document reliefs sets in at exactly the same time. And the availability of sculptors in Athens in the years after the completion of the Parthenon marbles is a prerequisite, but not a reason for the sudden start of relief production for private customers around 430. We have to keep in mind that in 6th and 5th century Athens, there had been an abundance of images of anonymous figures, potential representations of Athenians, on vases and on other objects for private use, however, not in media displayed in public. After the abandonment of private grave monuments in the early 5th century, there were no images of ordinary people in public, except for an occasional representation of one of the still rare votive reliefs. The Parthenon frieze was innovative in this respect too. It broke with the traditional choice of subjects for temples and, for the first time, showed a multitude and a variety of anonymous figures in public. And these figures acted in public, serving Athena either as participants in a procession or a contest, or in scenes of cult activities. They were not only young and adult men, and not only citizens, they were boys and elderly men and metiques, and on the east side there were women and girls approaching with cult instruments. And in the central slab, we have male and female representatives of two generations who demonstrate the Athenians' never-ending veneration of their goddess. The frieze showed ordinary persons in activities that the beholders themselves had experienced or observed. I think that the Parthenon frieze, produced after approval by the demos, opened the way for the private demand of images that showed Athenians in public space on grave and votive reliefs. In the frieze, all the mortals were shown as active servants of Athena. They had a good reason to be there and to be shown. On the grave reliefs, however, any family member might be depicted without special task or merit, and any family member might receive an own monument, even small children, even little girls, far from the age of being married off and becoming useful links to other families, and even some very old men whose high age is pointed out in the epigram. The remarkable phenomenon of the potential representation and commemoration of any member of the family, regardless of status, gender, age, merit, or service, can, I think, only be explained by the adoption of the idea of the state burial, the inclusion of all those who had died for the state. Just as the polis recovered all the war dead, gave them a proper burial ceremony, and commemorated them as members of the polis, the oikos, as the nuclear cell of the polis, assembled all the dead family members in a precinct, performed the customary rites, and commemorated them as members of the oikos. Reinhard Stuckerich considered the dependence of the private grave monuments on the public ones and suggested that the Dexiosis motif, the ubiquitous handshake, was taken from the state monuments. State monuments, however, did not have images before the 420s, and none of their images has a Dexiosis scene. It was not iconography that was borrowed, but the idea of participation. Daniela Marchiandi, on the other hand, took the emergence of the classical grave reliefs as proof of the ultimate failure of the principle of equality on which the institution of the state burial and democratic government had been based, and which would have prevented ostentatious display of individual prosperity and status. I, on the contrary, see the images of the reliefs as proof of the broad acceptance of the idea of inclusiveness as propagated by the state earlier and as evidence for its appropriation by the private sector. The idea of inclusion and sharing the community was visualized by images with innovative iconography. Whereas in archaic times, images at the grave had focused on the deceased person, the majority of the classical reliefs show more than one figure, and the figures are arranged in a way to suggest a contemplative confrontation, a kind of dialogue. The images thus convey that the dead person was part of a community. This participation is often stressed by adexiosis, a gesture not of everyday greeting or farewell, but an expression of a long-lasting bond. Grave reliefs that showed dead and surviving persons were not an Athenian invention, nor was apparently the adexiosis motif, for which the grave relief on Elina, produced at the end of the archaic period, is the earliest example. The relief on the right, from the island of Icaria, shows the deceased, a woman called Apollonia, as a mother of 3 children, with her 2 surviving brothers who had the relief made. There is, however, no contact between them and her. The survivors look at their dead sister from a certain distance, but she does not react. The scene reminds of the imaginary encounter with a dead relative on white lekythoi. The Athenians used group compositions and the adexiosis motive for the creation of images with a unique atmosphere and touching intimacy. The figures look at each other and shake hands. A communication can be suggested even without exeosis, just by the composition with figures facing each other and looking at each other. These are no imaginary encounters at the grave, as on the white lekythoi, and with few exceptions, there are no visual elements that refer to a tomb, like ribbons or lekythoi. In some cases, the composition conveys for which person the relief was erected, by showing one person as being the object of attention by the other ones, or by isolating one figure and thereby showing that she or he cannot communicate anymore. There are, however, many reliefs with 2 and more figures which do not make such a distinction. It was apparently not the principal intention of the images to highlight the deceased or to characterize him or her as being different from the survivors. The deceased person, as all other figures depicted in the reliefs, were shown as a social persona, in her or his capacity as a wife and or a mother, as a curious of a household, as a daughter or a son, and quite often in the company of others and united with them by a handshake. So, what was the intention of such images? Johannes Bergemann was the one who, in his habilitation thesis Demos ut Thanatos, published in 1997, argued most elaborately for a strictly political interpretation of the monuments and their images, political in the sense of relating to the polis and public interests. According to him, the monuments served as a demonstration of citizenship in the legal and the social sense, with the reliefs stressing genealogy and the continuity of the oikos, guaranteed by legitimate children. His reading reduces the reliefs to elements of a discourse driven by the interests of male citizens. My teacher Nikolaus Himmelmann responded with a small volume in which he emphasized the ritual and psychological function of the grave reliefs, as they were included in commemoration rites and helped to cope with the loss of a family member. I have to add that nowadays Bergemann would not maintain this one-sidedness of his approach anymore, but his thesis has found wide acceptance. The insistence on the polis is unsatisfactory for various reasons. After all, who is the polis, and when and where is it constructed? The ecclesia, the bullae, and the courts were the platforms for male Athenians and their decisions. In cult, an undeniably important part of polis life, female Athenians had their agency, their rights, their tasks, their duties, their responsibilities. We have seen how their responsibility for the care and commemoration of their dead relatives was stressed by the white lekythoi. Since one of the idiosyncrasies of the classical grave reliefs is the potential inclusion of any oikos member, either as a figure in a group composition or even as a figure honored by the relief, one should ask if the decision about the images and their design was not more inclusive than commonly thought. An interest in demonstrating citizenship and the perpetuation of the oikos was most obviously served by stelae without images that listed the names of the various kyrioi of the oikos in the order of successive generations. These stelae were the tallest monuments in the precincts and attested to the ownership and the persistent existence of the oikos. And there are reliefs that show parents with their son united in dexiosis and thus propagate legitimate offspring. The genealogical relationship might be underlined by inscriptions. However, there are many grave reliefs, prestigious ones and very modest ones, that cannot possibly be connected with issues of citizenship, genealogy, or inheritance. The high number of female figures in the reliefs, and they outnumber male figures, is one phenomenon that should puzzle those who insist on a political interpretation. And isn't it intriguing that so often females are shown among themselves without the proud curios? We have to keep in mind, of course, that grave reliefs in most cases were associated with others within a family precinct. But since they were ordered as individual reliefs and erected one by one in the course of time, we can take them as individual images that might have their own agenda. The epigram for Arestylla, for example, mentions the girl's parents, but shows her only with her mother. Even married women can appear in the presence of exclusively female figures. The epigram for Myrtis tells us that she was Heracleia's daughter and the wife of Moscius. The image, however, shows her only with her mother, with the names inscribed. And on the marble lekythos, a young mother is surrounded by 4 female figures. Many grave reliefs show the deceased person with surviving family members, and the scene is always calm, the figures are in perfect control of themselves. The reliefs are not given to expression of emotions. Gestures of mourning are restricted to touching one's cheek. Louder utterances like crying are reserved for slaves. Gestures are generally restrained. To touch the forearm of the person one is shaking hands with, as you see here, is an expression of intensive attention, almost an embrace, and there are some rare examples of embraces. Another gesture of loving care is touching the chin of the person who receives the attention. It is indicative that only women are shown acting this way, whereas a handshake is considered appropriate for anybody, even children. Recent studies of emotions in visual media will point the way to a differentiated assessment of the range of gestures of interaction. Victoria Reuchle, in her dissertation on the representation of mothers and their children in classical Athens, distinguishes between habitual gestures that visualize a long-lasting disposition, for example, philia toward family members, conveyed by the dexiosis, and spontaneous expressions of an emotion. Given the general tone of the grave reliefs, touches and embraces go beyond habitual gestures. In ancient Athenian society, and not only that of classical times, values and norms of behavior were commonly accepted and shared and were sure of the general consensus among male and female, young and old. It was clear what is a good mother. It is, however, worth asking who decided about the choice of visualizing a relationship of family members that did not correspond to the standard repertoire. After all, some women were not only shown in their ethos, their character as a mother, but also with pathos, emotion towards their kin, in images displayed in public, whereas this was not generally the case. I do not believe that the many female figures on the grave reliefs were merely the object of representation. They will have had an active role in choosing the compositions and the inscriptions. The well-known relief of Ampharete may be a case in point. It shows a woman with a baby who is reaching for the bird she holds in her hand. The epigram tells us that she died as a grandmother and is holding her beloved grandchild, her daughter's child. There is no mention of the male family members who contributed to the existence of these three generations. I deduce that it was the surviving daughter who decided about the composition of the relief and the epigram. When looking for the expression of female interests in the images of the reliefs, I do not mean to construct an antagonism to those of the Kyrioi, and I'm aware of the fact that neither the female nor the male Athenians were homogeneous groups. What I intend to do, though, is to analyze what the images actually show and not to squeeze them into a political, juridical discourse. There are so many images that show females in the company of other females, sometimes exclusively with other females, and images that convey attention and care either by gaze or by physical contact. The reliefs show us how an oikos, and not only its kyrioi, wanted to represent itself and how it wanted to commemorate its dead members. The many images of female figures among themselves, sometimes in interaction with each other, seem to be a reflection of the life of female Athenians, not as illustrations, but as tribute to the fact that they actually spent most of the day in the company of other females. The reliefs thus allow a unique view, not one that any other source could provide. If we ever get a glimpse of the self-understanding and construction of identity of female Athenians, we get it here. The institution of the state burial had been a decision of male citizens in order to honor those who had fulfilled a male duty, fighting for the polis, and who had given their lives doing so. The private grave reliefs were ordered by the oikoi and served their interests, and these might be the demonstration of citizenship and of legitimate offspring. Above all, they demonstrated the share in the appreciation of arete, sophrosyne, dikaiosine, by the choice of figure types that focused on the social persona and their controlled habitus, and the philia of the family members by the choice of his habitual gestures. Beyond this standard affirmation of common values, there were also interests to display constellations, communities, and personal relationships that were motivated by purely personal preferences and thus allowed a glimpse into social organization rather than social structure. Just as the Parthenon frieze, a monument of the Demos, had appreciated the share of the female Athenians in serving Athena, the grave reliefs monuments of the oikoi appreciated the oikos not only as the nucleus of the polis, but also as a social space. And this social space was to a large extent constituted, preserved, and shaped by its female members. All the innovations with regard to burial and commemoration that the Athenians came up with in the 5th century, the state burial, the white lekythoi, the tombs, have of course to be analyzed as part of the specific political and social context. I suggest to interpret the innovations as reactions and responses to existing traditions and recent innovations, and to abandon the one-sided view of the oikos as the domain of the curious. Thank you very much for your attention.